Hello and welcome to today's lesson. For our final video on the introduction and history of psychology, we're going to go ahead and take a look at psychology's subfields. These are the different career paths and subfields that psychologists can go into and focus on should you want to pursue psychology in the future. Some of the big differences we're going to take a look at today are the differences between clinical and counseling psychology, and also the difference between clinical psychology and psychiatry, as well as some other career options as well. So let's go ahead and take a look. The first thing we want to do is take a look at the difference between clinical and counseling psychology, as about half of psychologists fall into one of these two categories. The big difference between clinical and counseling psychology really depends on the types of people that they see and the types of issues that they are going to address. So think of a counseling psychologist as someone who's going to help with what we would consider to be more typical life changes. So that could be something like a marriage counselor, a family counselor, a school counselor, right? These are people who are going to help us with sort of the stress that is accompanied by normal life changes. Whereas a clinical psychologist is going to focus on more severe stressors. They might be responsible for diagnosing and treating psychological disorders. The type of therapy that a clinical psychologist might engage in is known as psychotherapy, which is essentially talk therapy. They can diagnose and treat different disorders, but they cannot prescribe medication. And we'll talk more about where that happens in just a little bit. Some of the other subfields of psychology include developmental psychology, which studies the physical, mental, behavioral, social, cognitive changes that take place across our lifespan. Different developmental psychologists might focus in on a specific area, such as child psychology or adolescent psychology, and others might focus in on the entire lifespan, so lifespan psychology. The third subfield we'll take a look at is educational psychology. And again, just like counseling psychology, where we see counselors in a school setting, we also see educational psychologists or school psychologists in a school setting. Oftentimes the role of an educational psychologist or a school psychologist is to work with school personnel, meaning teachers, administrators, other members of the school community, to help with the learning environment, behavioral changes, and other issues that we might see affecting students. So it might look at the effectiveness of their academic programs, different types of treatments or interventions. They also might help in assisting and developing specific interventions for specific students. Not every student is probably going to encounter or work with a school psychologist in their high school or middle school or elementary career, but they are usually present, at least one, in every school setting that we see. An experimental psychologist is going to, of course, design research experiments. And there's really two different types of research that an experimental psychologist might engage in. We refer to these as basic and applied psychology. Basic research helps us to understand some fundamental aspects about human behavior or thought processes. It's research that is done to help grow the knowledge base. It does not necessarily mean that we're going to be able to apply it to the general population. Applied research, of course, does mean we're looking to apply it, to implement it into larger scopes, into the general population perhaps, in order to see some effective change. So experimental psychologists are responsible for designing research experiments. They might work with animal subjects, or they might engage in certain drug trials with humans even, to try and see the effectiveness of different drugs, especially on neurological processes. This could be things like medications for mood and anxiety disorders, or even research into neurological diseases such as Parkinson's or Alzheimer's disease. Human factor psychology is a really interesting subfield of psychology that looks at the interaction between individuals and the systems, the devices, the technologies that we interact with on a regular basis. So what we're looking at is how do people use and interact with technology. Students interested in studying engineering, for example, may have an interest in human factor psychology because of the technologies or the other devices that they are creating or implementing have to go along with our cognitive processes, meaning the way that we work with technology has to be intuitive. It has to go with our natural thought process. So the more we understand about the way that we think and the way that we organize information in our minds helps us to develop technology that is going to be easier for us to use and more intuitive for us to use so that it becomes more seamless in our day-to-day life. And that's something that human factors psychologists are looking at when helping develop new softwares or new programs that are going to be useful for our daily lives. Industrial organizational psychology is a very popular field of psychology right now. This is taking psychology and implementing it into business models. So if you're interested in studying business, this might be something that is worth looking into. An industrial organizational psychologist is going to look at things like, how do we select and train members of our company? How are we going to improve productivity in our workforce? How are we going to improve our working conditions? All of this is going to help improve a business and therefore help improve business outcomes. The next subfield is personality psychology, which looks at why we are so different from one another. Personality psychologists work to develop different types of personality inventories that help us to measure different personality traits to help us understand who we are and what makes us who we are. Some of the different personality inventories that you might be familiar with are ones such as the Big Five, which measures conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion as either high, average, or low. You also might be familiar with the Myers-Briggs type inventory that looks at introversion and extroversion, sensing and feeling, judging and perceiving, and so on. One that's really popular right now is the Enneagram. And if you've taken that before, you know that it divides us into 9 separate personality types, and you might also have a wing personality type that helps us to describe our different tendencies and behaviors as well. All of these different types of tests just try and get down to the root of who are we and what makes us who we are. Another really lucrative area of psychology is what's known as psychometrics, which is essentially test creation. If you think about it, how many standardized tests have you taken in your career as a student? Everything from Prairie State achievements to MAP testing to the ACT or the SAT. All of these tests have to go through what's known as psychometrics to make sure that these tests are valid and reliable, and to make sure that these tests are fair for the students that are taking them. And at the end, we want to make sure the statistics that we get off of them, so saying if someone is in the 84th percentile or the 99th percentile on this test, actually says something in terms of how they compared against their peers. The final subfield of psychology that we'll take a look at is psychiatry. And psychiatry and clinical psychology are very similar in that they can both diagnose and treat psychological disorders. The major difference is that psychiatry is a branch of medicine. You have to have a medical degree in order to be a psychiatrist, because psychiatrists are the only ones that can actually prescribe medications as well as use psychotherapy or talk therapy to treat individuals diagnosed with psychological disorders. So that's really the major difference between clinical psychology and psychiatry. Both typically require advanced degrees. The clinical psychologist might have a PhD, whereas a psychiatrist will have a medical degree. So that's where we'll go ahead and stop today with looking at the subfields of psychology. There are many different careers that a person can go into should they want to pursue psychology in the future. Psychology is a subject that you can take with you into the rest of your life. Whether you plan on majoring in the subject or not, psychology is something that helps us understand the people around us and understand ourselves on a daily basis. I hope this gives you a good idea of the introduction and history of psychology and different subfields, careers, and approaches that we use in modern psychology today. So that's it for our introduction to psychology. By now we've taken a look at the history of psychology, the modern approaches to psychology, and the subfields of psychology. Next up, we'll take a look at the psychology of memory and see how we can use it in our everyday lives in order to improve our memory and remember more information, particularly in the school setting. Thanks for watching, and just remember, be kind to your mind.